In this video, I wanted to follow up on our discussion of glycolysis and continue on with the next step in the cellular respiration, the citric acid cycle. So we'll take the same approach. We'll talk about the citric acid cycle, what's going on, and the details we want to keep track of so that we can fully understand cellular respiration. So let's go ahead and get started. So the citric acid cycle, one complication is that sometimes you might also see this referred to as the Krebs cycle. So as with so many things in biology, there's often more than one name we can use to refer to it. So if you see citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, that means the exact same thing. All right, so this step, the citric acid cycle, immediately follows glycolysis. You'll remember from our discussion of glycolysis that glycolysis produces pyruvate. So this step, the citric acid cycle, will begin with pyruvate, and we'll talk about the specifics in just a moment. All right, so if this step starts with pyruvate, you might also remember that glycolysis produces two pyruvates. Remember that pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule, and we produce two of them because we began glycolysis with a 6-carbon glucose sugar. We broke it in half to make these two 3-carbon pyruvates. So every glucose that we begin glycolysis with, we will perform the citric acid cycle twice for each of those glucoses, once per pyruvate. We'll talk more about that at the end of the video. The other detail that has changed from glycolysis is that this step happens in the mitochondrial matrix. So we're going to move pyruvate from the cytoplasm into the matrix of the mitochondria, and then proceed with the chemical reactions of the citric acid cycle. So let's look at those chemical reactions. Okay, so the overall chemical equation for the citric acid cycle is shown here. Again, we're going to begin with the pyruvate that we made during glycolysis, and then we're going to need some of these energy carrier molecules we've talked about before. We're going to break pyruvate apart in the chemical reactions of the citric acid cycle, and we're going to produce 3 carbon dioxides, and then some of these energy carrier molecules that now contain energy we took from pyruvate. The other thing I want to point out is that pyruvate, again, is a 3-carbon molecule. You'll notice in the products of the reaction, we have 3 carbons present in carbon dioxide. During this reaction, we're going to take pyruvate, we're going to break it apart into smaller pieces. Those pieces are these 3 carbon dioxide molecules. So just as a reminder, everything in front of this arrow, those are the reactants or the substrates. Everything after the arrow are the products, and so we can see the reactants and products here. I've talked about these details before in our glycolysis video, but I just want to remind you that, again, pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. ATP and ADP are energy carrier molecules, where ATP has high amount of energy, ADP has low energy. So when we produce ATP, we've stored some energy in that molecule. And then NADH and NAD, or FAD and FADH2, they are forms of electron carriers. And the form that ends in an H, that H, the presence of the H gives away that they're that high energy form with the electrons. The form without the H, those are the low energy forms without the electrons. So as long as we can keep those details straight, we'll be able to recognize that these chemical reactions are producing these forms of these molecules that are holding on to energy that our cell can use. All right, so let's look more closely at the specific reactions that happen during the citric acid cycle. So here's a complete diagram that shows all of the steps. As you can see, it's very complicated. As we did for glycolysis, we are not going to pay attention to the names of the intermediates that show up in the boxes. We're not going to worry about the names of the enzymes that show up next to the arrows. We want to think about some simplified overviews of each step. So to accomplish that, let's look at a different diagram of the citric acid cycle here. And this one is broken apart into the 2 main steps I want to consider. So we're going to think about this in 2 steps. The first is where we're going to transform pyruvate into a chemical called acetyl-CoA. After that, we'll do step 2 down here, where we're going to catabolize acetyl-CoA. Remember that catabolism just means to break something apart into smaller pieces. That's that kind of chemical reaction. And those catabolic reactions always release energy. So along the way, we're going to break apart acetyl-CoA, and we're going to get energy out. We're going to trap that energy in those energy carrier molecules we were just talking about. Okay, so let's look at each of these steps in detail. So we'll start with step 1, transformation of pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. Remember, pyruvate is the product of glycolysis. So we've got our 3-carbon pyruvate molecule right here. That's our starting point. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove this carbon and 2 oxygens in the form of CO2. So we're going to break off one part of the molecule. That makes this 2-carbon molecule. In the next step, we're going to add something called CoA, or coenzyme A, to this 2-carbon molecule, just to modify it and stabilize it so that it will behave correctly in the following steps. So we add coenzyme A on. That's going to form acetyl-CoA, the end product of this first step. And along the way, we're going to produce one of these NADH molecules. Remember, that's an electron carrier, and that's the form with electrons that has a higher amount of energy. So in step 1, we remove a carbon, CO2. We add coenzyme A, CoA, and we produce one NADH. And at the end, we've got acetyl-CoA. We'll feed acetyl-CoA into step 2 of this process. So in step 2, I'm going to refer to that as catabolism of that acetyl-CoA molecule. Remember, catabolism just means to break apart, and it's going to release energy. So I'm just going to point out, here's our acetyl-CoA right at the very top of this cyclical diagram. We're going to put it into this cyclical set of chemical reactions. We're going to do a bunch of chemical reactions in a row, and along the way, we're going to produce some carbon dioxide here and here. Notice we produced 2 carbon dioxides. There were 2 carbons left in our acetyl-CoA. So we're going to break those 2 carbons off and release them as carbon dioxide. Again, these catabolic reactions, they release energy. So we're going to create some energy carriers. We produce an NADH here, another one here, and a third one up there. So along the way, we're going to make 3 NADH molecules. We also make one of these FADH2 molecules. It behaves just like NADH, and we produce it right here. And then lastly, we also produce an ATP molecule. So we produce one ATP right at the bottom of the reaction here. We make an ATP by capturing the energy that is coming out of these catabolic reactions. So again, we put acetyl-CoA in, we break the 2 carbons off of this acetyl-CoA molecule, those are the CO2s, and by doing that catabolic reaction, we get out all these energy carrier molecules, NADH, FADH2, and ATP. The only other detail I want to point out is why this chemical reaction is cyclical. So you see here where we put acetyl-CoA in, this again is our 2-carbon molecule, we stick these 2 carbons onto this 4-carbon molecule here. It's called oxaloacetate, but that's not important. We take 4 carbons from oxaloacetate and combine them to the 2 carbons in acetyl-CoA, and we make a 6-carbon molecule called citrate. Again, I don't want you to remember the names, I just want you to notice the math. 4 carbons plus 2 carbons makes 6 carbons. And then as we go around the circle, we remove carbons. So we go from 6 carbons, we take off a carbon dioxide, now we've just got 5 carbons left. From that 5-carbon molecule, we remove another carbon dioxide, and we've got 4 carbons left. In the rest of the chemical reactions, we rearrange those 4 carbons to remake that original 4-carbon oxaloacetate molecule that we needed to begin the cycle. So we put our 2 carbons in, we do some reactions to get energy out, and then we reform the starting material so that this cycle can always keep turning. But what we really care about, again, is the energy, and we've gotten these molecules out. So that's it. So let's think about the net products of the citric acid cycle. Again, we began with pyruvate. We break it apart into these 3 carbon dioxides, and along the way we capture energy in ATP, NADH, and FADH2. Per pyruvate molecule, we make 3 of those carbon dioxides, again, 1 per carbon that was present in the original pyruvate. Per pyruvate, we make 1 ATP. Per pyruvate, we make 4 NADH. And per pyruvate, we make 1 FADH2. But remember, this step happens twice. So the citric acid cycle happens twice for every glucose that we started with in glycolysis. So oftentimes we want to think of how much energy or how much product are we making per glucose. So since the citric acid cycle occurs twice for every glucose that we started with, if we think of this per glucose, we have to double everything. So remember, glucose has 6 carbons in it. When we break apart all the carbons, we get 6 carbon dioxides out, 1 per carbon that was present in glucose. Since we're doing this step twice, 2 pyruvates in, we're going to get 2 ATP out. 2 pyruvates in, we're going to get 8 NADH out. And if we put 2 pyruvate in, we're going to get 2 FADH2 out. So when we talk about the products of the citric acid cycle, more often we are interested in talking about the total amount of product from glucose, not just from 1 pyruvate. So we'll keep that in mind. So to wrap up, let's think about just the energy that we got from 1 glucose molecule after we completed glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. At that point, glycolysis has made us 2 ATP and 2 NADH. Then we took the pyruvates from glycolysis and we did the citric acid cycle. We make 2 more ATP, 8 NADH, and 2 FADH2. So in total, if we add those numbers together, we have a total of 4 ATP produced from each glucose, 10 NADH produced from each glucose, and 2 FADH2 molecules from each glucose. So at this point, we have a little bit of ATP energy, but the goal of cellular respiration overall is to make lots of ATP. And so in the next step, in the next video, we'll talk about how these electron carrier molecules, NADH and FADH2, can be used to make a lot more ATP. So we'll look forward to that in the next video. As always, I hope you'll ask questions if you have them, and I will talk to you soon.